It is one of the most replayed 73 seconds in human history. A clear, cold Florida morning, a white shuttle climbing into a hard blue sky on a column of fire. And then,
on the morning of January 28th, 1986, 7 people walked out to a launch pad at Kennedy Space Center and climbed into a vehicle that the world had come to see as almost routine. 24 shuttle missions had flown before this one. Spaceflight, for a brief stretch of the 1980s, had started to feel ordinary. That illusion ended 73 seconds after liftoff, when the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart in the sky over the Atlantic Ocean, in full view of a launch day crowd and a television audience that included millions of school children watching, because a teacher was on board. The image that followed, a pale fork of smoke splitting apart against a hard blue sky, became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. But that image, seared into public memory, tells only the first half of the story. It shows an explosion. It does not show what actually happened to the 7 people inside the vehicle, where they ended up, or what it took to bring them home. That part of the story unfolded not in front of cameras, but far out at sea, over the following 10 weeks, in water dark enough that divers sometimes couldn't see their own hands. It is a story of engineering failure, of an agonizing search, and of a medical investigation that reached a conclusion far more careful and uncertain than most people assume. It deserves to be told accurately, and it deserves to be told with restraint, because it is, in the end, about 7 real people and the families who had to wait to learn what became of them. The commander was Francis Dick Scobie, a veteran Air Force pilot who had already flown one shuttle mission. In the co-pilot seat was Michael J. Smith, a Navy test pilot on his first spaceflight. The mission specialists were Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer who had become only the second American woman in space; Ellison Onizuka, an aerospace engineer from Hawaii who had become the first Asian American in orbit; and Ronald McNair, a physicist who had grown up in segregated South Carolina and gone on to earn a doctorate from MIT. Rounding out the crew were 2 payload specialists, Gregory Jarvis, an engineer who had been bumped from earlier flights and was finally getting his turn, and Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire social studies teacher chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. McAuliffe had planned to teach 2 lessons from orbit, and it was largely because of her that schools across the country had wheeled television sets into classrooms that morning. The mission, designated STS-51L, had already been delayed 6 times because of weather and technical problems. The night before launch, temperatures in Florida dropped into the mid-20s, while outside the range the shuttle's solid rocket boosters had been tested for. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that built the boosters, raised concerns about launching in such cold and initially recommended against it. Those objections were overruled in a now well-documented chain of management decisions, and the launch went forward the next morning at 11:38 a.m. For the first minute of flight, everything appeared normal. Then, at an altitude of roughly 46,000 feet, a rubber O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster, stiffened by the overnight cold, failed to seal a joint properly. Hot gas escaped and burned through, eventually breaching the shuttle's large external fuel tank. The tank ruptured, and the resulting release of propellant, combined with aerodynamic forces on a vehicle now flying at supersonic speed, tore the orbiter apart. It is important to be precise about what that means, because it is the most commonly misunderstood part of the disaster. The fireball everyone remembers from the footage was the fuel tank's propellant igniting and dispersing, not a bomb-like detonation of the crew cabin. The orbiter's wings, engines, and cargo bay were shredded by aerodynamic breakup, not by explosion in the sense most people picture. The crew module, the reinforced forward compartment where all 7 astronauts were seated, separated from the rest of the vehicle largely as one piece. Still climbing on the momentum of the ascent, it continued upward for a short time before beginning its fall back toward the ocean, eventually striking the water at a speed investigators later estimated at well over 200 miles per hour. The shuttle program had no provision for this scenario. There were no ejection seats for the full crew, no separable escape pod, no parachute system for cabin. The vehicle had been designed on the premise that a catastrophic breakup during ascent was not something a crew could survive, so no recovery system existed for it. In the aftermath, NASA commissioned a biomedical review, led by Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a physician and former astronaut, to determine what had happened to crew in the interval between the breakup and the impact with the ocean. This report, released in July 1986, is the most direct and authoritative source on the subject, and its actual conclusions are more measured than popular retellings often suggest. The Kerwin report stated plainly that the cause of death of the crew could not be positively determined, because the force of the crew module's impact with the ocean was so severe that it obscured any evidence of what had happened earlier. The report did conclude that the forces experienced during the initial breakup of the orbiter were probably not violent enough by themselves to have caused death or serious injury. In other words, the structural failure that tore the shuttle apart was not, on its own, judged to be immediately fatal to people inside the intact crew module. What the report could not resolve was whether the crew remained conscious during the fall. It noted that if the cabin lost pressure, something investigators considered possible but could not confirm, the crew would have lost consciousness within seconds at that altitude, without an oxygen supply, and would not have regained it before the module struck the water. The report is explicit that this is a possibility, not a certainty. NASA and independent investigators have never been able to say with confidence whether the astronauts were aware of what was happening during the roughly 2.5-minute descent, or whether they lost consciousness quickly. One detail from the wreckage has drawn enduring attention. For personal egress air packs, emergency air supplies mounted near each crew seat for use in ground emergencies were recovered, and 3 of the 4 have been switched on. These packs required manual activation. They did not turn on by themselves. The Kerwin report treated this cautiously, noting that switching on a PAP could have been a reflexive, trained response to a sudden emergency rather than clear evidence of sustained awareness throughout the fall. It is suggested that at least some crew members reacted to the initial breakup, but it does not tell us how long that awareness lasted, or what, if anything, the crew understood about what was happening to them. Investigators were careful not to overstate what this evidence could prove, and any honest account of the disaster should extend that same caution rather than fill in the blanks with certainty the evidence doesn't support. In the hours immediately following the accident, the response was officially a search and rescue operation. Coast Guard aircraft and cutters, Navy vessels, and other ships already in the area converged on the debris field, which was scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean off Cape Canaveral. Protocol required treating it as a rescue until it could be established otherwise, even though many of those involved understood, given the shuttle's design, that survival was extremely unlikely. Surface debris, insulation, tile fragments, pieces of the orbiter's structure was recovered within the first days, but the crew module itself had struck the water hard enough to sink, and it settled somewhere among the natural clutter of the seafloor, roughly 100 feet down. Within about a day, the operations language shifted from rescue to recovery, marking the formal acknowledgement that no one had survived. What followed was one of the largest search operations NASA had ever coordinated, run jointly with the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. Search vessels divided the ocean into a grid and dragged sonar arrays across the seafloor, mapping it section by section and flagging anomalies, shapes too regular to be natural for divers to investigate. It was slow, exhausting, and often dangerous work, carried out in cold water with limited visibility, over weeks that stretched from January into March. On March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the accident, Navy divers working from search vessels located the crew module roughly 18 miles northeast of the launch site in about 100 feet of water. The following day, divers from the USS Preserver made a positive identification of the compartment and confirmed the presence of crew remains. NASA's public statement was notably restrained. The agency confirmed that families had been informed and said it would make no further comment until recovery and identification were complete, out of what it described as deference to the family's wishes. Recovery of the wreckage and remains was not a single event, but a prolonged operation. The USS Preserver's divers worked the site through early April, and additional recovery work, including the use of the submersible vehicles Sea-Link I and Deep Drone, continued through mid-April. NASA announced the completion of crew cabin recovery operations on April 16, 1986, nearly 11 weeks after the accident. Throughout this phase, NASA kept press aircraft and cameras at a distance from the recovery site. This was not concealment for its own sake. Contemporaneous accounts describe it as a deliberate decision to prevent the recovery of human remains from becoming a media spectacle, and to give the families time to be informed privately before any detail became public. Once recovered, the remains were transported to Kennedy Space Center and, in early May 1986, moved by military aircraft to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware for identification and preparation, using the forensic method available at the time, dental records, and other standard techniques. Each of the 7 was identified. Their final resting arrangements were left to their individual families. Several crew members were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, while others were returned to their home communities. The Challenger accident led to a 32-month grounding of the shuttle program, while the solid rocket booster joints were redesigned and NASA restructured aspects of its safety review process. The presidential commission that investigated the accident, the Rogers Commission, concluded that the technical cause was the O-ring failure in the cold, but also pointed to a deeper organizational problem, a pattern of accepting known risks as normal until they proved catastrophic. Those findings reshaped how the agency made launch decisions for the remainder of the shuttle program. More than 3 decades later, in 2022, a television documentary crew searching for an unrelated wreck off the Florida coast discovered a large section of the shuttle's wreckage on the seafloor, one of the largest single pieces of Challenger debris found since the original recovery operation. NASA confirmed the find and reaffirmed, as it had in 1986, its intent to treat any recovered material connected to the crew with the same care and respect shown at the time of the accident. It is easy, retelling a story like this, to lean toward the dramatic, to state as fact things that the actual investigation left open. The honest record is more restrained than that. Investigators could not determine with certainty how long the crew remained conscious, or precisely when death occurred. What is documented is this. The breakup of the orbiter was probably survivable in itself. The crew module fell largely intact for roughly 2.5 minutes before striking the ocean at high speed. At least some emergency air packs were manually activated. And the impact of the water was the event investigators pointed to as the fatal one, though even that could not be established beyond doubt, given the condition of the wreckage. What is not in doubt is the scale of the effort that followed. The 10 weeks of searching, the hundreds of square miles of ocean covered, the divers who did difficult and often disturbing work far from any camera, and the decision, made and kept by NASA, to let 7 families learn what happened to their loved ones privately before the world learned any further detail. That, as much as the accident itself, is part of the Challenger story. Not just how the mission was lost, but the quiet, careful work of bringing its crew home.